Welcome to this week's PowerPoint lecture. This is a discussion of the globalized view of persuasion. And the idea behind the globalized view of persuasion is that persuasion is everywhere. So the more traditional view of persuasion, what your reading calls the restricted view, looks at communication and says it's either persuasion or it isn't. There's a clear line between what is and is not persuasion. The globalized view, which is what this whole chapter is about, says that there are many gray areas with communication, and often persuasion is present, but it's subtle and really hard to see. And in fact, what we know about persuasion is that often it's most effective when it is subtle. So one of the things the globalized view of persuasion says is that a singular message that isn't extremely persuasive all on its own may become persuasive if it's repeated over and over again. And we understand that repetition is how advertising works, so we don't normally look at it. Sorry, folks, I'm going to fix that by next week. So we don't usually look at it as propaganda. So if you saw the Just Do It and the Nike Swish just once ever in your lifetime, when you saw it again, you wouldn't equate it with Nike. But because it's advertising, it's repeated over and over again in various ways with different advertising campaigns. It creates this cultural meaning. So you don't even have to see the sneaker. If you see the Nike Swish and you see the Just Do It logo, you know you're probably thinking Nike sneakers. That's really effective advertising. Clear persuasion. One of the things that happens, though, is that all this repetition, not only can help a message become more persuasive like it does with advertising, but repetition like that can actually turn the message into something else altogether. And that's how a lot of internet memes are formed. So here you can see the most interesting man in the world, Dos Equis. I don't often drink, but when I do, it's Dos Equis. And that ad was on over and over and over again. It was a really long format. It was unique and different, and it ended up becoming something completely different, which you can see here. Okay, so what we're going to spend the most time talking about today is what's called persuasion in the guise of objectivity. So these are messages that have the appearance of objectivity, but they might not actually be objective. And so often when you look at something like this, so something like a newspaper article or a history textbook, you don't even think of that kind of communication often as persuasive. But here's how it works. So think about the history textbooks you've used all throughout your school lives. They seem objective for a bunch of reasons, partly because your teachers gave them to you, and students don't think that teachers tell them anything but objective facts. But when you think about it, of course, it is not possible to cover all of history, even a small period of history, in a textbook. So decisions must be made about what to include and what to leave out. Now, a bunch of people make these decisions. So some decisions are made by the authors, some decisions are made by editors and publishers, and then some decisions even get made by elected school board officials. And all of that happens over the course of writing it and editing it. And what gets included and what gets left out shapes what we know about our history, and so what we know about ourselves. Usually there's no intentionally nefarious purpose involved in this editing process. It must be done, but it matters who those people are who are making the decisions, because they're going to include certain things and not others based on what they think is important. That inevitably ends up leaving some groups out and their stories left untold, and it's a way of, it can be a way of making different groups sort of invisible to our culture, like they don't have any history. And what ends up happening is textbook publishers, nobody wants to be unique, and everybody kind of, they need to fit into learning objectives and Common Core, and so everybody, all their textbooks kind of tell the same stories and they contain the same things. And so what we do and don't learn about ends up becoming solidified. And there's a historian named James Lowen who has written this terrific book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And he's a teacher and he's a historian, and he provides a ton of great history examples how this works. So in one example, Lowen gives us the most frequently told version of Christopher Columbus's arrival in America, and that's the passage that you see here on this slide. And so everything that you see in red on this slide is what we have solid evidence to believe is true. All the black text on this slide is, for whatever reason, stuff that we don't have evidence to support. Now, how does that happen? Well, the historians sometimes make assumptions, or the people who write the textbooks who may not be historians make assumptions. So you can see that right here, the writer has said that the 3 ships were pitifully small. We don't actually have any evidence that tells us what size those ships are. So somebody is assuming that they were pitifully small, and so we come to have that, it becomes true. We think it has become true. And then the other thing that happens is that textbook writers want to make history interesting. So they add small details like Columbus dying unappreciated and penniless, even though we don't know that for sure, because it's a more satisfying story. Even things like artwork contribute to giving us the idea that we know things about our history that we actually have no evidence for. For example, there were no portraits of Columbus painted during his lifetime that we know of. This portrait at the top of the slide was done by Sebastiano del Piombo in 1519, but again, we don't know what Columbus really looks like. Let's finish with a really quick discussion of ideology. Your book defines dominant cultural ideologies as the systems of belief, that's the hard part, systems of belief that tend to go unquestioned in a society. Now, ideologies are culture bound. They are different from place to place and across time, and they're really hard to see. And because they're really hard to see, we don't question them. Okay, and so they end up fitting well into a discussion of the globalized view of rhetoric. Now, in the discussion forum last week, some of you framed advertising as propaganda, and you were totally on the right track thinking that way, but conventional advertising isn't usually categorized as propaganda. But it fits really well in a discussion of ideology. So again, one advertisement viewed one time isn't going to make a large impact on an individual, but the combined effect of multiple advertisements can create an ideology that impacts how we think about ourselves and everyone around us, beyond even the product the advertisement is selling. So here you go, folks. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. All right, Justin Timberlake, I'm loving it. And you've got this really well done campaign, and McDonald's and pop music become intertwined. And selling Justin Timberlake sells Big Macs and vice versa. Okay. All right, finally, a lot of people write critically about what this McWorld means. And this is really important to think about because we truly live in a global world now. So look at the content on this slide. It's from the style section on Disney's website. I promise I'll fix this before next week. Okay, why might some people be concerned that there's a type font? Here you go. Type font based on Belle, or an adult line of clothing inspired by Tinkerbell. Companies like Disney aren't just selling toys to kids. They're selling a lifestyle, and many would argue that they're selling an ideology. So what we need to ask ourselves is, who does that ideology benefit? And more importantly, who, if anyone, does that ideology harm? And what, if anything, do we need to do about it? Okay, that's it, folks. Have a good week. Let me know if you have any questions. And that's it. Bye-bye.